Alright, hello. Today I'm going to be talking about the trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633, which took place in Rome. This event is often remembered as a dramatic moment where science and religion directly clashed. Galileo is usually portrayed as a hero of science being crushed by an anti-science church. But historians today argue that this version of the story is too simple. Instead of just science versus religion, Galileo's trial involved debates over the authority, interpretation, politics, and institutional power. The main question I want to think about is not just what happened to Galileo, but why it is important that it happened the way it did to him. Who had the authority to define the truth in early modern Europe, and what happens when new knowledge challenges old systems of power. And there's just, Why Galileo matters. Galileo matters because his trial sits at the intersection of scientific change and social authority. He lived during a time when Europeans were beginning to rely more on observation and experimentation, but they still lived in a world deeply shared by religious institutions. It's important to understand that Galileo did not see himself as attacking religion. In fact, he believed he was protecting both science and faith. However, his ideas raised different questions about who had the right to interpret nature and scripture. Historians like Maurice Frinicio, hard to pronounce, argue that Galileo's trial was not simply science versus religion, but a conflict between conservation and progressive attitudes within both scientific and religious communities. Some background, obviously it's in 1600s in Europe, early Europe. To understand Galileo's trial, we need to understand the world he lived in. Early 17th century Europe was undergoing what historians call the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Kepler, and Galileo were challenging long-standing beliefs about the universe. At the same time, the Catholic Church was responding to the Protestant Reformation and was very concerned with maintaining religious authority and unity. Ideas that seemed to threaten doctrine or encourage independent interpretation were treated cautiously. Science and religion were not separate spheres yet, they overlapped constantly. Most scientists were religious, and religious authorities often weighed in on scientific questions. Alright, we have to talk about his telescope because that was kind of his whole thing. So, in 1610, Galileo made several important observations using his telescope. He observed mountains and craters on the moon, showing that heavenly bodies were not perfect. He also discovered 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, which challenged the idea that everything revolved around Earth. Most importantly, Galileo observed the phases of Venus. This observation supported the Copernican model where Venus orbits the Sun. According to historian Owen Gingerich, these phases behaved in ways that made sense only if Venus was moving around the Sun. However, it's important to note that these observations did not prove that the Earth was moving itself. Other models like the Tychonic system could explain some of this data. Why did Venus matter? Well, the phases of Venus were powerful evidence, but they didn't settle the debate completely. This uncertainty is crucial. Galileo's ideas were controversial not because they were true, but because they challenged long-accepted explanations. Scientific knowledge at this time was still developing. There was no single agreed-upon method for deciding which model was correct. This meant that debates over astronomy were also debates over authority and credibility. Scripture and science. One of the most controversial aspects of Galileo's work was how he talked about Scripture. In 1615, Galileo wrote a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina explaining his views. In the letter he wrote to her, Galileo argued that the Bible was not meant to explain how the universe works. As historian Greenwich summarizes Galileo's argument, it teaches how to go to heaven, not how the heavens work, or heavens go. This statement did not deny the authority of Scripture, but it limited how Scripture should be used. Galileo suggested that a natural phenomenon should be studied through observation and reason, not biblical interpretation. For church authorities, this was dangerous. If individuals could decide when Scripture applied and when it didn't, religious authority could weaken. There's some dialogue. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. This book compared the Copernican and Ptolemaic models through a conversation between characters. Although Galileo claimed to be neutral, the Copernican character clearly appeared more persuasive. Church officials viewed this as disobedience, especially because Galileo had previously been warned not to promote the heliocentrism as fact. This publication pushed tensions to a big breaking point. Now we get to the trial. In 1633, Galileo was summoned to Rome and questioned by the Roman Inquisition. He was accused of violating earlier instructions and promoting heliocentrism. Under pressure, Galileo was forced to recant his views. He publicly denied that Earth moved and was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. While he avoided execution, the punishment sent a clear message about who controlled acceptable knowledge. And it's important to say here that he publicly denied the Earth moved, but I believe he still believed in his observations, obviously. So for one of my primary sources, I used the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, and it shows Galileo as a careful thinker trying to reconcile science and faith. In teaching this source, I would would want people to focus on Galileo's tone and strategy. He's being very respectful, but also confident in what he's saying during this letter. He does not reject religion, but instead he limits its role in scientific explanation. My next primary source is the recantation. This document shows the other side of the story. It reveals the power of the institutions and the consequences of disobedience. I think people should see how authority operates through language, ritual, and public submission. A contrast between Galileo's private reasoning and his public denial is quite fascinating, kind of striking. There is a historical debate. A lot of historians disagree on what happened and what it's about. For example, Maurice Finuccio, his last name is so hard to pronounce, argues that the Galileo affair is often pretty oversimplified. He writes that there was a split within both science and religion, and that the real conflict was between a conservative and a progressive attitude. Some church officials actually supported Galileo, and some scientists actually opposed him. This challenges the idea that the trial was a simple battle between the two sides of religion and science. Why does this still matter? Galileo's trial raises questions that are still relevant today. Who gets to decide what counts as the truth, and how do institutions respond to new knowledge? We still see conflicts between expertise, authority, and public trust in debates over climate change, vaccines, and technology. Studying Galileo helps us understand how knowledge is shaped by power, not just evidence. That's it.